Last night's upset win over number 5 Tennessee was further proof that South Carolina's men's basketball team possesses a championship caliber defense.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available, as always, wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, and also on YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now, as new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Lamont Paris and the South Carolina Gamecocks continue to let everybody know that, hey, we are one of the best teams in all of men's college basketball right here, right now, as the Gamecocks went up to Knoxville and took down the number 5 Tennessee Volunteers, something that very few teams in the sport period have been able to accomplish against the Volunteers over the past couple years. And last night, Lamont Paris and the Gamecocks, they weathered the storm relatively easily. So we're going to talk about how the game played out on today's show. We're going to talk about their championship caliber defense that was on display, how the clutch gene has shown up several times this season for this squad, and we're going to answer the question regarding Meechie Johnson's recent slump. Is it time to worry about his recent performances? We'll dive into all of that on today's Locked On Gamecocks. The way in which South Carolina defeated Tennessee last night is further proof that their defense is championship caliber. There are several ways in which the Gamecocks showed this on Tuesday night. One, let's talk about Dalton Knecht. Everybody in the conference, other teams' fan bases, especially the media before the game and during the game, we're talking about Tennessee's star offensive player. And sure, Dalton Knecht, he still scored 31 points against the Gamecocks on Tuesday night. But that is a bit misleading, because before the 254 mark in the second half, Dalton Knecht was only shooting 33.3% from the floor. He had only made 6 of his 18 shot attempts by that point in the game. In essence, he got a lot of empty buckets that sure helped pad his stats, but did not really affect the game's final outcome until maybe the final 30 seconds, where South Carolina had to hit some clutch free throws, which happened thanks to the play of Miles Stute and also BJ Mack. Everybody else for Tennessee shot 29.4% collectively from the floor. So, South Carolina, sure, they let Dalton Knecht score a bunch of points against them, but they pretty much locked down everybody else. And that leads me to my second point for why this is a championship caliber defense, why they showed this on Tuesday night. Zakai Zeigler, Tennessee's point guard, cannot make any mistake about it. He is very important to their offense. In a lot of ways, Zakai Zeigler is basically Tennessee's version of Meechie Johnson. He might not be quite as big or as stocky as Meechie Johnson, but Zakai Zeigler plays in a very similar style compared to Meechie Johnson. He is an explosive guard, he likes to run downhill, and he's either going to take it to the rack and try to get off the glass, he will dish it to a big man or kick it out for a three-pointer, and sometimes he will just sit back and he'll get an open pass and he'll take a three-point shot. Very similar to how Meechie Johnson likes to play. Meechie Johnson and Talon Cooper did a fantastic job defending Zakai Zeigler on Tuesday night and making life extremely difficult for him. Because Zeigler was not able to do what he usually does against Tennessee's opponents, it forced the Volunteers to play a lot more isolation basketball, a lot more one-on-one situations. And that plays right into the hands of South Carolina's defense with how they want the game to flow. So that was a really big deal as this game played out on Tuesday night. The fact that Zakai Ziegler could never get into a rhythm, it really stymied this Tennessee offense. And the last thing to note about the championship caliber defense that was shown up in Knoxville is the fact that Lamont Paris's team once again won the physicality battle against their opponent. Now, in years past, Tennessee, they dominated this aspect of the game against South Carolina. And last year, that was really on full display because South Carolina, with a very young team in terms of experience, they just got bullied, quite honestly, by a Tennessee squad that not only had experience in terms of the amount of time that they have played at the college level, but also guys who were big, guys that had a lot of length, a lot of height and size to them. And so I was worried about that going into this game. But then I looked at Tennessee's roster, and I noticed how their front court was a lot smaller than it has been in years past. So I kind of felt like this might be an area of the game where South Carolina, they can actually win head-to-head against Tennessee. And that's what they did. The Gamecocks got 40 rebounds compared to Tennessee's 36. They also made a bunch of hustle plays on Tuesday night. And I would say more hustle plays than the Volunteers. And Dalton Knecht, this is probably a great example of how South Carolina's physicality wore down the Volunteers as the game went on. Dalton Knecht, going into last night's game, was an 80% free throw shooter. So basically, 4 out of every 5 shots, he's going to make from the free throw line. Dalton Knecht missed 4 free throws on Tuesday night, which turned out to be critical because the final deficit, or the final point margin in this game, was 4 points. I'm not saying it just came down to those free throws, but pretty big deal there for South Carolina. And the announcers even on the SEC network, I believe it was Tom Hart who was doing the play-by-play and Dane Bradshaw who was the color commentator. They both noted late in the game that Tennessee just looked worn down. They looked just exhausted. And unless Tennessee's just in really bad shape in terms of their conditioning, which I highly doubt that that's the case, you have to point to South Carolina being the reason why they were indeed so worn down when it mattered the most in last night's basketball game. So the reason why I think overall that this team has a championship caliber defense is because for the second time in the last 7 days, South Carolina has faced a team who was highly respected nationally. Last week it was Kentucky, this week it was Tennessee. Both those teams possessed an offense where they like to run out in transition. In essence, they want to get out in a fast break and they want to run the floor to get themselves a good look before you can get set defensively. Both of those games now, South Carolina has taken the game and they have forced their opponent to play by their rules, essentially. You're going to have to play in the half court, and you're going to have to make tough shots offensively if you want to score on us. Kentucky couldn't do it last week. Everyone said, well, they just took advantage of their youth. Well, what are they going to say about this game? Because Tennessee came into last night's game with 356 combined starts at the Division I level just in their starting lineup. And Tennessee fans are sitting there talking about how, well, if we didn't miss all those layups, we would have won last night's game. South Carolina got 3 points from Meechie Johnson on Tuesday night. And we're going to talk about Meechie Johnson a lot more later on in the show. But Meechie Johnson did not do a whole lot in terms of scoring. And also, South Carolina shot about 35% from 3 on, I believe, 29 total shots from behind the arc. They left several three-pointers on the table on Tuesday night. BJ Mack had some open three-pointers that he missed. Meechie Johnson had a couple that he missed. And they weren't the only ones. South Carolina probably had like 5 or 6 three-pointers that they would have hit under usual circumstances. But, admittedly, the physicality of the game probably had an effect on them too, and that's why they missed some of those shots. But it's not like Tennessee was the only team that was missing some open opportunities. Okay, so let's just squash that right now. South Carolina won this game. They went into Knoxville and they beat Tennessee at their own game. They were more physical than them and they played better defense than them at the end of the day. Point blank, period, end of story. Nothing else to say about it. That defense could lead to South Carolina legitimately contending for a title at this point. Whether it's the regular season title here in the SEC, maybe a conference tournament title. I'm not going to go so far as to say the national championship. I'm not going to take that big of a jump just yet. But it's clear that with the way that this team is playing right now, this defense is going to keep them in every single ball game. Doesn't matter who they play. They're going to stay in it because of the defense that they have. Now, the Gamecocks also have showed another trait in some of these games so far this season, a trait that absolutely will serve them well when they get to the month of March. We'll talk about that trait in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Now, we are less than 2 weeks away from the Super Bowl, which means the NFL season is almost over, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. FanDuel has listed some Super Bowl 58 MVP odds for a bevy of star players between the 49ers and the Chiefs. And Deebo Samuel is a part of this list. Of course, Deebo was a superstar when he was here at South Carolina, but FanDuel doesn't seem too high on him as an MVP contender, as his odds are listed at plus 3,300. So, if you think Deebo might go off in the Super Bowl and snatch that MVP from one of the two contending quarterbacks, then that might be a bet to look at over on FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and you can bet on anything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup with FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Welcome back to this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. South Carolina's men's basketball team right now, they possess a lot of qualities that fans, coaches, and pundits alike really value with this team as far as their postseason opportunities are concerned. But there's one particular quality that this team has that is going to pay dividends in the month of March, and that is the composure they exude in close games. South Carolina, simply by the way that they like to play, they're going to obviously be in more close games than other teams might. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because when you think about teams that make it far in the NCAA tournament, there's rarely ever a team that goes to, say, the Elite Eight or the Final Four or the national championship game, and they got all the way there without having to win a very close game, a game that went down to the wire in the final couple minutes. And the thing that you gotta like, if you're a South Carolina Gamecock fan, is the fact that Lamont Paris and his team, they've already been through several close games, and more often than not, they have come out on top. Going all the way back to the beginning of the season, South Carolina defeated Virginia Tech by 2 points in Charlotte. They defeated Grand Canyon by 7 points over in Arizona. They did lose to number 24 Clemson by 5 up in the upstate. They defeated Mississippi State by 6 points in their SEC opener. They defeated Missouri by 2 in overtime on the road, lost to Georgia by 5 at home, defeated Missouri by 8 at home, and they just defeated number 5 Tennessee on the road by 4 points just last night. Overall, South Carolina currently is 9-2 in games that are decided by 9 points or less. Now, some people might take that statistic and they might look at it a different way. They might sit there and say, well, Andrew, couldn't you also say that this means that South Carolina has a tough time slamming the door shut on some of their opponents? Maybe you could say that. But the thing is, all these teams that I just listed off, maybe outside of a Missouri and to a certain degree a Georgia, these are really solid teams. And all those teams have the potential or are likely going to be in the NCAA tournament once we get to the month of March. And that's the thing I really like about how South Carolina is setting themselves up for the next month and a half or so, because the Gamecocks, they've already faced several teams that are likely going to make a run in mid to late March. And they have proven themselves worthy more often than not. And think about this. They lost to Georgia by 5 at home, sure. But the Clemson game was on the road. South Carolina's worst performance of the season, which was not a close game, took place against Alabama. That game was in Tuscaloosa. South Carolina had a stretch in that game where they missed 12 straight shots. Have not seen that happen often with this team as of late, and probably won't see that happen again, at least I don't think so, for the rest of this season. And even then, Alabama still only scored about 70 points, far below their season average. Can't forget that aspect. So again, the defense still, for the most part, held strong, but the offense just completely fell through that night. So, if South Carolina does get to, maybe they go far in the SEC men's basketball tournament, or they make it to the NCAA tournament, which again, with every passing day, seems a lot more likely. If they get into a close game, and they've got to outplay their opponent in the final 8 or 4 minutes, as a Gamecock fan, you might be on the edge of your seat. You might be sitting there thinking, where's my heart medication at? But South Carolina, I think for the most part at this point, they're going to remain calm because they're going to be in that game and they're going to be thinking to themselves, we've been here before several times and we know that we can pull this one out. And also, I think that it's a great representation of their head coach, Lamont Paris. Think about it. Lamont Paris compared to Frank Martin. And I'm not going to try to go too deep into this conversation here, but we all know how Frank acted on the sidelines, okay? Frank would just blow up. He would eviscerate one of his players. He could eviscerate an official. He could be yelling and screaming at any moment during a basketball game. And obviously, especially when you're in a high-stress situation, sometimes that can have a negative effect on your players. Lamont Paris, he rarely ever goes off on one of his guys. And if he does kind of reprimand them for maybe a play that they just made or that they didn't make, he makes sure to do it to the side, one-on-one, to talk through what all happened, what they should have done, or at least, try to figure out why did you go about that play the way you did. And I think that's rubbed off on his players to the point where his players, if Frank Martin was coaching this team, South Carolina probably has lost at least half of the games that I just listed off a few minutes ago. No lie. But Lamont Paris being the coach of this team, they've won the majority of these games. Obviously, you can't just narrow it down to the emotion of your coach. I understand there's a lot more factors that are involved in games that are that close. But that's a big part of it, in all honesty. So, if South Carolina makes it to the NCAA tournament and they're playing a team close in the first or second round, as a Gamecock fan, honestly, you should not be worried at that point because you should look back on what they've done up to this point in the season and just remember that South Carolina, they've been there, they've done that, and they can do it again. So, all the qualities that they have right now, their ability to maintain their composure in close games is something that's going to be tough for opponents to deal with once we get to March. Now, speaking of tough, South Carolina star guard Meechie Johnson, he's gone through a real tough stretch recently when it comes to shooting the basketball. But the question is, should we be worried about Meechie's slump on the offensive end? We're going to dive into the answer to that question in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Jace Medical. Now, I know that we all gravitate to sports, and some of y'all might gravitate to this podcast to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life. But I want to talk about real life situations for just a minute here, because according to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. And that is a really scary thought to have. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if one of my family members got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from the life-saving medication that they needed. Thankfully, we're all going to be okay because of the good people over at Jace Medical. The Jace case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, among others. This stuff could happen to any one of us. So, visit jacemedical.com and complete your physician encounter today. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared for real-life situations. Go to jacemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. Now, South Carolina's basketball team as a whole has done quite well on the floor in recent games. But one player that has gone through a bit of a slump throughout that stretch has been Meechie Johnson, at least when it comes to how he is shooting the basketball from the floor. But I'm here to tell you that as a Gamecock fan, I don't think you should be worried about Meechie Johnson's current slump. At least not right now. Looking at Meechie Johnson's last 6 games, basically the first game that South Carolina played against Missouri onward, Meechie Johnson is currently averaging 8.16 points per game in this stretch on 31.4% shooting from the floor and 31.2% shooting from behind the arc. Now, it should also be mentioned that during the same stretch, Meechie Johnson is also averaging 4.17 rebounds and 3.17 assists per game. So, it's not like Meechie Johnson isn't affecting or impacting the game in any way, shape, or form. He has made hustle plays when it comes to grabbing rebounds, and he also has been willing to dish the ball off to some of his teammates on the offensive end. It's not like he is playing selfish isolation basketball and just having possessions where he's just telling everybody to get out of my way. I'm going to go make a play here. He hasn't done that a whole lot the past couple games. Tennessee game's a great example. The three-pointer that Talon Cooper shot late in that second half that I believe put South Carolina up 56-50 at that point and kept it a 2-possession game, that happened because Meechie Johnson beat his man off the dribble, went into the paint area, and then kicked the ball out at the perfect time to Talon Cooper, who was wide open. He put up the 3-ball, he nailed it, and that wound up being one of the biggest shots of the game for South Carolina. And that was something that Lamont brought up post-game when talking to the media. So again, I'm not saying that Meechie Johnson isn't doing anything to help the team, but obviously, Meechie Johnson is somebody that this team leans on when it comes to his ability to score the basketball, whether it is him taking his NBA range 3-point shots or him using his explosiveness and overall athleticism to penetrate through a driving lane and get to, okay, let me just, whether it is him shooting NBA range 3-pointers or him attacking a driving lane and going straight to the basket, either putting the ball up or dishing it off to one of South Carolina's front court players like a Josh Gray or a Kyler Murray Boyles, etc. So, let's now answer another question. At what point do the Gamecocks really need Meechie to be Meechie once again when it comes to scoring the basketball? In my opinion, that game is February 14th, when South Carolina goes on the road to take on the Auburn Tigers. If you're curious to know, the 3 games that are taking place before that game against Auburn are at Georgia, then versus Ole Miss at home, and versus Vanderbilt at home. I don't feel like that South Carolina has to have a Meechie Johnson who is on fire offensively to win either of those 3 games. Even the Ole Miss game, which at this point is looking like one of the bigger games that they might be playing in the final month and a half or so of this regular season. Vanderbilt, you should be able to beat Vanderbilt. If you lose to Vanderbilt at home, there's quite frankly bigger problems to address with that. And then Georgia showed in their first matchup against South Carolina, they're basically just going to take the ball and try to drive to the basket and draw fouls. That's their whole offensive game plan. And so therefore, they're not going to take a ton of outside shots. That should be a game where South Carolina can make some things happen. I don't expect them to shoot that badly again, like they did the first time when it came to their shooting from behind the 3-point line and also how they shot at the charity stripe. So why is it I think that Meechie needs to be Meechie once again by the time the Gamecocks take on Auburn? The reason is this. Auburn under Bruce Pearl's watch always has really athletic guards. Guards that can dish the ball out well, be facilitators, but also can score the basketball. Guards that can take you off the dribble. Guards that can shoot the 3-ball. Basically, guards that can do a little bit of everything. Auburn has had that almost every single year seemingly under Bruce Pearl. And this year, Auburn also has a really good defensive team. I believe that they actually rank higher than South Carolina when it comes to defensive efficiency on KenPom. So, my point here is South Carolina is going to take probably a collective effort when they play the Tigers if they want to knock off Auburn in Neville Arena, which is going to be a very difficult task. Yes, I know they just took down Tennessee up in Knoxville, and that's certainly a tough place to play. But Neville Arena, when they show up for a big game, that is one of the most imposing environments in all of men's college basketball. It 100% is. And so, by that point, considering the personnel the Tigers probably have at the guard position, Meechie Johnson, he's got to be himself again by that point. So, he's got a couple of games here against Georgia versus Ole Miss and versus Vanderbilt at home. And the good thing about those home games is that Meechie, statistically speaking, he has done better at home this season. So, he's got a couple of home games to get himself back into a rhythm, get that confidence back in terms of shooting the basketball before South Carolina goes on the road for what right now, as long as they don't slip up here in the next couple of games, is setting up to be a massive showdown with Bruce Pearl's Auburn Tigers. So, as far as his current slump is concerned, you don't have to worry for now. But if it carries over into the Auburn game in a couple of weeks and beyond, then at that point, it would be fair to be concerned about Meechie Johnson's play on the offensive end. So, with all that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Thank y'all so much for listening or watching today's show. As always, what are y'all's thoughts on South Carolina's defense and what they've accomplished in the past week? Do you think that this is a championship caliber defense? What are your thoughts on how the Gamecocks have handled some of these close games up to this point in the season? And lastly, are you worried about Meechie Johnson's current shooting slump, or do you think that he's going to be just fine within the next few games or so? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watched today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.